Good evening, Mr. Becker. Thank you so much for coming in today for podcast conversation. I've learned a lot about you and your career, and I'm excited. I've got a lot of things written down here. I usually don't try not to prepare too much for my conversations, but I kept finding things online and watching you speak and just learning about your life and career that I was interested in. So I'm glad that we can do this today and have a little conversation.
Well, thanks, Jake. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm totally curious about what you've discovered online. It's a little scary.
Well, I think the first thing is next year you're going to be head of school at Taft, place where you went, and a beloved institution for you. And I think maybe we could start our discussion about what Taft was like for you as a student, and why it was such a amazing place for you, somewhere where you want to go back to and lead. I know that you were born and grew up in New Orleans, so coming to a New England boarding school was probably a whole new experience for you, and it was it seems like a successful opportunity. And just a little bit about what that was like for you.
So it turned out okay. Success was not inevitable. I'm a bit of a mutt actually geographically. So I actually grew up in Manhattan and then moved to New Orleans in the middle of my childhood, which was my mom's family home. And I was in mostly in public school in New Orleans especially for fifth through eighth grade. And so actually going to boarding school for me was an incredible opportunity that was made possible through financial aid and through my grandparents. And I went from a pretty big 7th through 12th grade magnet public school with, I think, about 2,000 kids, which is all in one big building in the middle of New Orleans, to these sprawling fields of boarding schools when I was looking, and ultimately chose Taft. And I got to Taft, and I wasn't particularly, sort of well prepared. And the school, in a lot of ways, taught me how to learn. I shared a version of this with the school when I was announced as head back in the late fall. I did not make very good use of my first 2 years there, and it was a little touch and go through 9th and 10th grade. And then through a series of events, sort of came back for junior year, and not unlike a lot of kids I've known over the years since then, but really through a bunch of things that I was not in control of, I kind of got a second chance. And I bought in probably for the first time and decided to kind of go for it and take advantage of all the resources that were there. And a particular story that was among one of the turning points at the beginning of that 11th grade year was a teacher by the name of Steve Shefflin. He was one of a few faculty who really that year, I don't know, I still go back in time and I'm like, what was going on in 9th and 10th grade? I know there were teachers who were reaching out to me. I was not particularly receptive, I don't think. And Steve Shefflin was an English teacher, coach, doing all the things. And the English department, I was in standard English, and they said in the middle of that term, we think that you should move into whatever it was, honors English or something like that. And I was like, okay. So I moved into this other section, and because the section I moved into was just reading the book that the section I had moved out of happened to have just finished, Mr. Shefflin, or at least that was the reason he gave, Mr. Shefflin said, in the meantime, why don't you meet with me once or twice a week in my office, and we're going to read Billy Budd. And I had no concept of Billy Budd and Melville, any of this stuff. And it was in those maybe 4 or 6, I don't know how many meetings there were, but you think about how, I think now retrospectively, how precious those hours are for a boarding school teacher to take one-on-one with a kid who was very much a work in progress. And I point to that as when I learned how to learn, certainly how to read closely, and develop a certain kind of confidence. Because I think I was one of those kids who was probably just fine, hanging in the background, flying below the radar. And his belief that I could do this thing, along with a bunch of other adults at the same time, and I happened to meet my future wife at the same time, people believed in me, and that gave me a certain kind of confidence to actually care and apply myself. And at that point, it really was sort of off to the races for me, just in the sense of taking advantage of everything academically, athletically. I started getting involved in the arts really for the first time since middle school. That was okay. And the rest of my kind of both academic and life trajectory has been relatively positive since then, thank goodness. But that at the beginning of junior year, that was not obvious.
So what do you think it was about Mr. Shefflin as an English teacher? He devoted this time directed towards you to help you, I guess, build confidence in such a critical stage of your life. I really resonate with that a lot as an English teacher, and being at a school like Gilman and like Taft and like the Frederick Gunn School where you are right now. I feel like that's so important at our schools, devoting one-on-one time with students and really getting to know them and showing that you care about them on a one-on-one basis. So that really registers with me.
Yeah, so we here at Frederick Gunn, and we do this because of the kind of educator and person that Mr. Gunn was, and Abigail Gunn, his wife. We talk about hope-filled faculty. When I say that, I think about Frederick Gunn because I know his story really, really well and read his biography and all of that. But I also think about a couple of people, including Steve Shefflin, this way. He had hope in me that exceeded any real reason, or belief in me, which I think is probably the definition of hope, right? He had belief in me that exceeded the data that I was presenting to him and to other teachers. And rather than sort of be annoyed with me, focus on kids with more potential, or who, he sort of reached over the wall that I was putting up, and he didn't do the work for me. We've all as educators experienced that, like, look, kid, we can lead the horse to water, but at the end of the day, we really, 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 no matter how much parents would like it, we cannot make the kid drink. He reached over and sort of helped me get a lot closer to the bucket, and then sort of did that, like, look at what you can do. And I think about back and forth, because I've done a lot of teaching and done a lot of coaching, how similar it is to a coach building confidence in a player. Mm-hmm. Essentially, I know that if you follow this path and you actually do the work, you are going to make the improvement. And as you start to see that improvement, you're like, oh, I didn't know that I could do that, but look, I can do it. And it's sort of the next step and the next step and the next step. And eventually you become kind of that autodidact, and you reach the point where you can sort of teach yourself. But that hope filled, like he believed in me beyond what I was giving him, and not all teachers do that. But he certainly did it for me, modeled it for me, and it's informed a lot of what I do and think about ever since.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think that speaks to, the power of the teacher to see into the future. You, as a teacher, you've had experience and age and just life behind you where the formula for what it takes, and you can really put that belief into a child, because that the formula for success in life really isn't too complicated. It's time, it's commitment, it's hard work, it's a little bit of luck, but it's really buckling down and doing what you need to do in this English class, reading Billy Budd to get to the next step, and I think teachers can see that, at least good teachers can.
And I think, we've had 2 of our 3 kids have had the privilege of growing up in a Montessori environment, which is not something I knew much about until they were in it. I think what the teacher and the school, which is to say the sort of ecosystem of teachers collectively, can also do for the kid, because the formula on one level seems pretty straightforward, but what teachers also can do teachers and coaches and other, I refer to them as non-parent adult mentors, is give students a taste, kind of an imagination of what they can achieve. And for me, in working with Mr. Shefflin, there were kids in my class that I'm sure I thought of as like, oh, well, I'll never be as good at English, at reading or writing, and navigating that Harkness dynamic. I'll never be as good as fill in the blank, smart kid in my class. And what Steve sort of helped sort of coax me down the road without knowing that was what was happening. He was like, he basically showed me like, you could totally hang with these people. You just need to frankly do the work. And I didn't have an imagination for that. I saw myself as, they're the smart kids, the kids this comes easily to, and I'm just not one of those. And he was like, essentially, you can totally be one of those. And he did that. Coaches did that for me. My advisor, those 2 years really did that for me. And it gave me a taste of sort of a better version of Peter Becker than the one that my 15, 16-year-old self was carrying around in my head.
So I also read, or I was watching your kind of incoming speech at Taft, I guess in the fall, and so I picked up on that story about Mr. Shefflin, but I also, towards the end, you talk about Willy MacMullen, who you're coming in after at Taft, who's had a long, illustrious career, 22 years at Taft. You described that, coming in after him is humbling and also daunting. But I thought it was so interesting that he cut you your senior year from soccer. And I was thinking, that experience must have done a lot for you in terms of rebounding from that, because I can imagine how difficult that probably was for you senior year.
Yeah, it was. All my best friends were on that team. I say that, right? And of course they weren't, but it felt like it at the time. And look, nobody ever confused me for a really good soccer player. Ironically, I've gone on to coach more soccer than probably any other sport, but that's a different issue. So, getting cut from that team, what it did was, all of a sudden I was one of those seniors without a fall sport. Like that was never on my radar of possibility. And I don't think I took it well at first. I then had a goal, which is to go to UVA and get in early. So it did help me put together a pretty good fall academically, because I had nothing but time. And I have since cut a lot of kids from a lot of teams, and it taught me pretty immediately that this feels like the end of the world the day that the list goes up and your name's not on it, and then it's Tuesday, right? Like these are actually not that big of a deal. You're gonna be fine. Your life didn't end. You have a lot to be grateful for. I couldn't have said any of that in the moment, but again, I was moving at the same time into year 2 of what became this extraordinarily special relationship with a very wise woman, my wife, Amy Julia. And so she was also a pretty good coach along the way to essentially be like, dude, get over it. That means you can come visit me at Princeton maybe once, in a while and stuff like that. So did it teach me resilience? I'm sure it did. In the moment, I was pretty much just a dude with a chip on his shoulder. And I had a great fall. Like the whole senior year was amazing. And I had time, which was a luxury that I had not had for most of school up until that point.
So these experiences that you had at Taft, I'm just curious how they shaped your philosophy and maybe your willingness to get into education, because I know you did a variety of different things before going to Lawrenceville and becoming a teacher and a coach. But I love, I watched a little bit of you talking about Frederick Gunn School and how your mission there, or one of your goals is to turn students into forces in the world. And I really like that. I resonate with that a lot. But really your experience at Taft, I would assume, set you up for kind of this philosophy and education. And I'd love, if you wouldn't mind talking about how that came into play, how that came to be, just your philosophy.
Yeah, and it's funny. I don't remember being confronted with that phrase, philosophy of education, until I applied for my current role, the head at Frederick Gunn School, where I had to write it as part of the application. And I would say that it emerged gradually over time. I referenced, I can sort of look back on, none of us had a perfect experience in high school. And so there are things I can point to from my time at Taft that I say, oh my gosh, that was totally transformative. And other parts that I would say, gosh, if I'm ever in charge of a school, I want to make sure we don't do that, right? Not bad, like not actively bad, but just, not intentional, not necessarily aligned with mission and stuff like that as far as, what happened for me in terms of developing that philosophy of education was actually my time at UVA was totally transformative and very formative in terms of both meeting some educators there as professors who really taught me how to think about some big picture issues that have been through lines for me ever since then. I volunteered with an organization called Young Life and as a soccer coach at St. Anne's Belfield, and got to work with students one-on-one, and just really enjoyed that sort of early taste of mentorship. And then I was on a trajectory to go into investment banking. I did that. And once I got there and sort of took a bite of the apple, I was like, oh, it doesn't actually taste as good as I thought I would. And for a variety of reasons that we can talk about or not, made the decision to leave within that first year. And I went to work for the same organization, Focus, the Fellowship of Christians in Universities and Schools, that my wife was working for, with some local schools in Richmond, Virginia, where we were living at the time, and then getting back up into New England and other things like that. But what I got to do is work again with kids one-on-one. And then it was through that we decided to look at boarding schools. And I went back to Taft and talked to Lance Odden, who was my head, legendary head from that era. And I said to him, Mr. Odden, how'd you know it was time to retire? So it was 2000, 2001, he was retiring. And he said, it's the first year that I can't remember the name of every kid in the school. And he was this sort of legendary figure in my life. And he planted a seed about the possibility of us working in a boarding school long-term, such that once we were doing it, once we were in the work at Lawrenceville, the combination of what I had started to think about as far as what is education for, how does student formation happen, the work with kids one-on-one through Focus, through coaching, and then at Lawrenceville, and then connecting back to my own experience, what I realized was the power of boarding schools in particular. This is true in day schools, but just not in that 24/7 way. So the power, the formative power of a boarding school, when it's really aligned with a mission very clearly, and all the adults are working in concert in their own diverse ways to create an environment, an ecosystem that equips the student to grow and thrive over time, to become essentially whatever it is that the school then says, well, this is what we want our graduates to be like and to do in the world. So for the Frederick Gunn School, and Mr. Gunn's biography and model has informed my own philosophy of education pretty much every day since I first picked up his biography as I was thinking about applying for this job. So for him, it was active citizenship, moral character development towards the end of active citizenship, which we sort of shrink down to be this thing, to be a force for good in the world. And other schools have other goals or ends in mind for their students. And that's a beautiful thing. That's actually one of the things I love about independent schools. But so my philosophy of education is really one about what the power a school can have in the life of the student if they start with who are these students and faculty as human creatures. How do we as humans learn and grow most effectively? And that's that sort of path that you referenced about how growth, like it is kind of formulaic actually. And when everybody in one of these intense independent school environments is on board with that program, the opportunity for growth is, really unique in education, pretty much, full stop.
Yeah, I almost think of independent schools, boarding schools as like mini social experiments, like each school has devoted years and years of education and trying different things out. And it's interesting to me, I've been doing interviews with heads of schools and different teachers. A lot of the mission statements are very, very similar. It's building men and women of character to enter the world and to shape the communities that they live and work in as adults. Whether this is the language or not, turning kids into forces for good in the world, building character traits like respect, humility. I know you talk a lot about excellence and striving towards excellence. But yeah, I did an internship my junior year, going into senior year of college at Choate. So I got a little bit of a taste for what the boarding school life was like. And, I see what you're saying, the 24 hours around the clock interaction between adults and students, that definitely, it has a huge effect.
Yeah. And I actually I've been convinced recently that I don't think many of our schools have developed, I think, sufficiently their what I'll call like sort of theory of human growth and change. And so I've been really influenced. So I've been influenced by a bunch of different people, but one of them is a scholar at UVA named James Davison Hunter. And he wrote a book around some of this called Death of Character, Moral Formation in an Age Without Good or Evil. So it sounds bleak, and to some degree his diagnosis is a little bit bleak, but the positive side of it is, and I've been influenced recently by a lot of the conversation in the last sort of 10 years around habit formation, which is both new and really, really old in human history. And I would love for independent schools, boarding and day, to really step back and evaluate what do we think are the component pieces that enable, for me it's high school, but middle school, high school students through these really dramatic phases of learning and growth to grow, to change with a particular goal in mind. So citizenship is, for the Frederick Gunn School, what we have in mind, active citizenship. And so how does a high school student in 2023 move along the continuum from, most 14-year-olds are not particularly interested in being an active citizen. They're more interested in themselves, right? Their own, satisfying their kind of immediate appetites. Mm-hmm. We're not surprised by that. We're not bothered by that. That's who the kid is. Great. And when we meet the kid who's already pretty altruistic, phenomenal, but we can't design around them. We have to design around your sort of typical 14-year-old kid from all these different backgrounds. And then you say, well, how does, and I think Steve Shefflin would have been a brilliant person to ask. Frederick Gunn had really good instincts around this. How do you nurture and support the student through the inevitable process of sort of trial and error, recognizing that by age 18, by senior year, that student has capacities for metacognition and self-evaluation that they just don't have when they're 14. Mm-hmm. And then how do we train all of our teachers and administrators and frankly parents in that theory, so we're a little bit less surprised when high school kids act like high school kids, and can meet their frenetic energy, their anxiety, their sort of typical behavior with an approach that sort of receives them the way they are, and then does that work. And it's often one-on-one through a coach or a teacher, to equip them to become those sort of have the capacity to do that self-teaching, which is a uniquely human capacity. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've been thinking a lot recently about just the future with ChatGPT and, phones and devices and earphones. Like you walk into class, everyone's got earphones in and phones in front of them and computers, and it's no one's fault, but it's just the world that we're living in right now. And the artificial intelligence is really, it's fascinating to me. It's interesting, but it's also sort of scary. And I'm curious, from your perspective, stepping into the head of school at a boarding school, like what challenges or uncertainties do you really see in the future, like the next 10 years here with just technology, the after effects of COVID, I think playing a huge social enabler or disabler in some ways. Like it's hard for students to have conversations with each other, I feel like, after a period of such disconnect. Are you pretty hopeful? Are you optimistic? What's kind of on your mind in the next 10 years regarding this?
I'm super hopeful, because I just mentioned sort of what humans are able to do. So humans are able to do really terrible things. We're the only, I think, species that might exterminate itself. Squirrels are not going to undermine their own existence, but they're also not going to create, ChatGPT. So, or fly to the moon, or all the things. So, I think it is. I think one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is, I'll bring this back around to technology because I think a lot about the technology, but I think it's a symptom, not a cause. And then it becomes, part of the cause. But the concern right now, the rightful concern right now about anxiety and depression, rising rates of suicide and other really tragic things like that. I think the challenge ahead of us, the opportunity ahead of us, is take a step back and ask questions about what does it mean to be human, and that we need to go back to both ancient and much more recent sources, and recognize that the students who walk through our schools aren't going to have good answers for that. They're not going to have thought about it any more than the class before them and the class before them. So we keep getting better at this as adults, but we sort of forget the kids are the same level of development that they pretty much have been all along. So I think of the challenge. What does it mean to be human? What are we for? What is life for? These are ancient questions that we used to kind of ask. And many families have said, like, I don't know. And schools have also kind of given up because we're a little bit worried that if we're too definitive about that our families are going to accuse us of brainwashing okay. And that's a good thing to be concerned about maybe, but in the meantime, we've just left a void, a vacuum. And so I'm starting to think that the crisis of anxiety and depression is really a crisis about meaning and purpose. And we're not doing a good enough job coming alongside our students. And in part because if we admit it, that we might not know the answer. And folks like Lisa Miller, she's a professor at Columbia. I listen to a lot of Krista Tippett, the On Being podcast and the On Being project, are not afraid of these questions. They're not afraid of the messiness of it. And that, for me, has been an invitation, both with my own kids and with students, to say, look, my job is not to tell you what the meaning of life is, but my job is to invite you into the conversation, because it's going to really matter that you, in these transformative teenage years, begin to develop the capacity to ask and explore and start to answer some of these questions for yourselves. And in the absence of that invitation and the absence of giving students practice at answering some of those questions, they, literally are left to their own devices. And guess what? TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram and all the stuff are super happy to fill that void. Mm-hmm. And what I experience as a parent myself, I experience it as an advisor to my group of advisors. And what I see from a lot of other parents and a lot of educators who are incredibly capable people, we're all feeling really overmatched by, again, the symptom, the technology that then becomes its own cause. And so my hope comes from developing, and I think we honestly have to do this school by school, educator by educator, the capacity to start to get back to some big questions about the meaning and purpose of life. What does it mean to be human? And then let's engage these devices. Because right now we don't have a standpoint from which to really have a theory about artificial intelligence. We're just worried. And if you're from conversations I've been having, you're more worried if you're in an English department than if you're in a physics department or or a science department, right? That's a little broad brush, but we don't really know why we're worried. We just know that there's something going on that is not actually human. It's not actually for humans, right? It's not interested in human flourishing. Mm-hmm. And we don't know how to get the genie back in the bottle. And the reality is we're not going to. And so we have to figure out how to equip this next generation of students starting today with how to use these devices wisely and well, not how to get the genie back in the bottle. It's just not going to happen. Now, I think there are some moves that lots of educators have been making for a long time, where we can give students just a little bit more structure. Again, I'm thinking about this in the context of a boarding school where we try to get kids to turn the light out. I ran a dorm the year that the iPhone came out, and then the year that it went from Wi-Fi connectivity to the internet only to 3G. And I remember when 3G happened, all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, we just lost control. Wi-Fi used to cut out at 11. Now, how do we adapt? And you have to adapt. And it may be that you make every kid put the phone outside and get an alarm clock. This, Deerfield and St. Andrews are getting good press around some of those pretty basic moves. And I'm sort of curious, why have they had the courage to do that? And the rest of us, including myself, are like, oh, I'm a little bit worried that the kids are going to be upset and the parents aren't going to like it and blah, 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 blah. I think they're doing right by their kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you make a really interesting point, an important point about responsibility and teaching responsibility almost, because all of these tools, these technological tools are helpful if used in the right way. I mean, we're talking over Zoom right now. We connected over email. That the internet came out at one point, and people were probably really scared about that. The future of technology, yes, things are going to change and we're going to adapt to it, but I think the root, capabilities of humans will be forever. And responsibility as a young person is one of the most important things to learn and understand. I think, for students to understand what they're passionate about or what they like is really important, because then you have something to orient yourself towards and to strive for, and can use these tools in pursuit of that goal. And it's less hazy and uncertain than it is, right now when you're just thinking about the future of technology.
Yeah, and I was a history teacher, and I think we can have wonderful debates about, like, if you had to pick just one discipline for every student to really get good at, what would it be? I would pick history, because I think history shows that humans are, and that this is true of every one of us, including me, really capable of beautiful, grace-filled, loving things, and horrible, anti-human, destructive things. And I'm really intrigued. I've never met Mark Zuckerberg, probably never will. He's a boarding school kid. Like, whatever we think the impact of Facebook and Meta, and I'm not on the positive train on that thing, that he's a product of one of our schools. And so we had an opportunity to shape this one individual who's gone on to have such a profound impact on global culture, and to some degree, sort of that's on us. So I don't believe in unfettered technology. I really would be an advocate of, teachers still requiring students to write essays in class and just have to deal with that a little bit. And at the same time, I want them to learn how to use ChatGPT and the other, large language things really, really well. Mm-hmm. I was playing around with it last week, so I was like, I can't remember how I phrased it, because you learn pretty quickly that how you phrase the question really can be determinative of the results. So I started asking it for, what are the top 5 strategic priorities for a boarding school in New England? Gave me a pretty good answer, in the sense of, like, those are like the 5 things. And it cut out in the middle of it. And so I hit regenerate and gave me a slightly different list the next time. That's not inherently bad, except for if I just relied on that, all of a sudden I'm forfeiting my human capacity to think for myself, to think with colleagues around a table and come up with answers that are in some way that we might not be able to prove in a test tube, but uniquely human.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and authentic. I think that's important. Well, the other thing I'd like to ask you about today is just the legacy of Willy MacMullen, and you're taking over for him in July at Taft. So what are some of the things that, I guess, going into your role as the head of school at Taft, that you want to keep the same or change, and maybe what will you be bringing with you from your career at the Frederick Gunn School to this new position?
Well, I'll start just with Willy. I mean, he is a consummate educator, leader, and has been, is not only a graduate of Taft, but has worked there since, I think, 1982. And so that legacy of faithfulness to a particular place, we all know is a lot more rare these days than it used to be. And as he said, I think he said a version of this the day that he introduced me. His love for the place is just really remarkable. And so I really respect anyone, but particularly him for the ability to love a place and be committed to a place over time. It's really remarkable and admirable. And basically, by definition, right, I can't live up to that. I've worked at 2 other schools. I love Taft, but I may never love Taft as much as he does. And there's just such a goodness to that. I think so. I don't have a big sort of change list or change agenda. I think that would be foolish. I think that Taft. I mean, it goes back to, frankly, a version of what I was saying before, and really the work that we've been doing here at Frederick Gunn for the last 11 years is to, without getting into navel gazing, just really keep asking that question: why do we exist? Why does this particular school in this particular place in this particular time exist? And so for this school, there just happens to be this amazing founder. I mean, I would say Frederick Gunn. I've read lots of biographies of different heads of boarding schools. Huge John McPhee fan. So the headmaster, Boyden at Deerfield, like I get all the stories. I would say Frederick Gunn is the most remarkable boarding school founder that I know of, bar none. Would love for people to share counter examples, mainly because it would just be such good stories coming together. And so it was really easy to help. I'm sorry, it wasn't easy. It was really fun and life-giving, I think, certainly for me and for everyone else involved. And it was a total team effort to say, all right, let's go into this person's life and his wife's life and legacy. He was born and raised in Washington, Connecticut. He's the son of 2 people who died a couple who died in a pandemic when he was 10 years old, raised as an orphan by his older brother, kind of listless after finishing at Yale, and then was essentially a convert to the abolitionist cause. He set out to prove abolitionism wrong first, and his 2 older brothers were outspoken abolitionists. And then he realized, like, oh no, I'm wrong. So the ability to change your mind when your older brother and align with an older brother, like, that's a superhuman move in the first place. And then to dedicate his life to that and leading the Underground Railroad, to becoming a founder of the outdoor camping movement in the United States, dedicated to a particular town, build a school, and just a remarkably thoughtful educator. Once you start to tease that out, you're like, oh my gosh, like, yes, let's just do that. Mm-hmm. So the goal of moving to my alma mater, my wife's alma mater, is not to make Taft like some other school. It's to say, okay, what's in the Taft DNA? And not every school can be proud of every element of its DNA. And so you have to sort of tease that out, and you have to make you have to reconcile yourself sometimes to that, and the school does institutionally. But what is it in the Taft DNA? And I'm really, Taft has this beautiful portrait of a graduate that was a product of work that Willy led in his first couple of years, that I think is a wonderful sort of picture of what a graduate of that particular school could be. It would resonate with lots of schools, but it has some elements that are particular to Taft. Taft has had the motto, non ut sibi ministretur sed ut ministret, not to be served, but to serve, since Mr. Taft started the school. And he talked about educating the whole child. And I think when he did it, it was 1890. It maybe was a little bit more unique than it is today. But I'm excited to really learn the place all over again. I haven't spent a ton of time there in the last 30 years. And then begin to ask the question, so who are we? Why do we exist? And then are we living up to that? No school, Mr. Gunn said, toward the end of his life, he said, I have in mind the ideal of a school. And he goes on to say, and you ask me, have I ever seen the ideal? And he's been running the school he started for 26 years. He says, I've never seen this ideal. And so to enter a place that was so transformative for me, had such an impact on my wife, on my brother, on a lot of my good friends, and to say, all right, what are we here for? Are we doing service? Are we educating the whole child? We're never doing it as well as we can. And then let's set ourselves to that. And what do we want to be for the next sort of 25 years? And I think every school should be doing that basically all the time. It doesn't have to be threatening. It can be really exciting. It can really, I mean, there's so much in every school that you just can affirm. You'd be like, oh my gosh, look at, you're doing service so well here, and you're doing, you know, educating the whole child so well over here. That's awesome. How do we just do it more and better? And so that I think is what the work is about. I'm excited just to get to know the place again. For the kind of all over again.
Love it. Well, Mr. Becker, thank you so much. One last thing that we do on the podcast episodes is I usually ask each guest for a book recommendation, but it seems like the Frederick Gunn biography has come up multiple times, and it's, you know, it's top of your list. But if you have any other suggestions, I really want to read that book. I want to learn a little bit more about him. I only know just the Wikipedia overview, and that's a shame, you know. So
I recommend. So it was originally called The Master of the Gunnery, and it is newly reproduced as the biography of Frederick Gunn. And I recommend it to everybody, especially if you like 19th century literature. Each chapter is written by a different alum, and then the last chunk is some of his writings and letters. So it is, if you're an educator or the leader of a school, it is life-giving. And then the other one that I would mention is a book by a guy named Thomas de Zengotita, who I don't know if he's still teaching part-time at Dalton and part-time at NYU, but he wrote it in the early 21st century. And it's called Mediated. And he put his finger on many of the trends that we see today in the ways in which our relationship to technology and screens in particular shape us. So there's this thing, captured Greece, took its captor captive, and it's about the Roman Empire taking over Greece, and then the Hellenization of the Roman Empire. And I think about that a lot with these devices in our pockets. We buy them, we're the owner of them, and then they take us captive and have this formative impact on us. And Thomas de Zengotita put his finger on this before Facebook, before Instagram, before any of it, before the iPhone. And I read it when I was a teacher at Lawrenceville, and I've been an evangelist for it ever since.
Love it. I'm going to have to read that too, especially with the artificial intelligence stuff, because I think that's very, very important. Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time today. I wish you the best of luck as you go to Taft, and you know, I hope the rest of the year at Frederick Gunn goes well. But thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciated talking to you.
Thanks, Jake. I appreciate it, and good luck to you and everybody else at Gilman.
Thank you. See you soon.
Take care.